So at this point, now that I've introduced the concept of triads, we're going to start talking about how to actually spell these triads. And there's a few different ways. So the first way you can do it is by interval. So there's a particular interval between each chord member in a triad. If you were to play every single note on the piano, we would be moving chromatically. And these are by half steps, so minor seconds. All these minor seconds can be combined together to form the various intervals that we have in music. Now, if you don't already know how to spell intervals, of course, you need to go back and watch your musical core, because that's where I actually talk about how to create scales, chords, and intervals. This is going to be too advanced for you if you don't already know how to identify intervals and identify scales. So when you're spelling a major triad, the major triad consists of a major third between the root and the third, and a minor third between the third and the fifth. This creates the sound of a major triad. So you can start on any bass pitch, which would be the root of the chord. You could start on a D, spell a major triad on D. You'd have a D, an F sharp, and an A. If you want to start on E, you have E, G sharp, and B. These are all going to be major triads because they share the same interval relationship between the root, the third, and the fifth. If you want to spell minor triads, the interval relationship is reversed. So instead of a major triad on the bottom, you have a minor triad on the bottom. And instead of a minor triad on top, you get a major triad on top. And it gives the interval a less stable sound. So here's a minor triad. If you compare that to the major triad, this feels very stable. It doesn't have a lot of dissonance. It just is content to stay where it is. You make it minor. Suddenly it feels somewhat unresolved. That's what creates the angst in a minor triad. Anytime you add dissonance to something, it creates this need to resolve. So that minor triad, it doesn't feel so stable anymore. You want to make a triad even more unstable, you can create a diminished triad. And that's where you have a minor third on the bottom, and then a minor third between the third and the fifth. That creates the diminished sound. This sounds really unstable, and it was used very sparingly in tonal music. In more modern music, we tend to accept dissonances more readily, but in the classical period, they wanted to avoid this really dissonant sound. For one, if you remember the overtone series, the first overtone in the overtone series is an octave. So if I play any pitch on the piano, say this low C here, what I'm actually hearing are a series of overtones above that note that combine to create the quality of C. So the first overtone that I hear, and again this is also talked about in the musical core in more detail, is a C. So I play this C, first overtone I'm hearing is an octave. If I play the next overtone, it's a perfect fifth. And then I hear a perfect fourth. And then I hear a major third and a minor third. So that's how we essentially came to this idea that the major triad was really stable, because within the first two octaves of the overtone series, we find our major triad. The minor triad is considered minor because it occurs further on in the overtone series. And you can actually demonstrate the overtone series to yourself if you have an acoustic piano. Just as a quick example, in the classical period, pretty much all pieces began and ended in major, with few exceptions. There's a few pieces that are in a minor key. And the reason for that is a sense of stability that they felt the major keys provided. So in order of stability, we have a major triad, which has a major third on the bottom, a minor third on top, a minor triad which reverses that. Then we have a diminished triad, which is built entirely of minor thirds. You hear how we're starting to get more dissonant. And then we have the augmented triad, which is used very rarely, and it really only occurs on the third scale degree in a minor key. So you have the notes C, E, and G sharp would be an augmented triad. So where the diminished triad is built on minor thirds, the augmented triad is built entirely on major thirds. And often when students are trying to identify chords, the diminished and the augmented, they tend to get confused by those two because they're both very dissonant. But you'll notice the augmented triad just has a slightly more open sound because you do have that major third on the bottom, and that just opens things up a little bit. So it's almost like you got the overtone series and the augmented triad. It almost fits, and then it adds on the fifth. And now you have this dissonance that doesn't exist until much further on in the actual overtone series. So here we see an example of all the different triads laid out. Here's your C major. If you look in the lower left corner, C major. Here's your C minor. Here's your diminished. We use a little degree symbol. You'll notice next to the C it's a degree symbol. And then augmented, we use a plus sign. So these are the four basic triads that are used in classical music to create all the music that Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, all these great composers actually created. And there are more triads that were added later, but they were used more sparingly for color and to create a sense of sort of mixture between two different keys, which is something we'll talk about much later. So another way that you can identify triads, if the interval thing doesn't work for you, and honestly you should identify triads in all the ways that I'm teaching you today, because they're all important. They'll all have a role depending on how you're actually approaching the music. At some point you'll need to identify them every single way I'm teaching you. Another one is to just take the major triad. So stack notes in thirds starting on the first scale degree of the major key, and use a key signature for accidentals. So in the key of C major, there's no flats, no sharps. So I would just have the notes C, E, and G. If I want to build a minor triad, I take that third from the major triad and I just bring it down a half step. Now I have a minor triad. If I want to take it one step further and make a diminished triad, I take that fifth and I lower the fifth by a half step. If I want to build a diminished triad based on the major triad, I have to lower the third and the fifth. But you'll see how we're progressively from the major to the minor to diminished, just closing in closer to that root. And the closer you get to the root and the more dissonance you create with the natural overtone series, the more dissonant the chord is actually going to sound. So here's your major triad. Lower the third for a minor, lower the third and the fifth for diminished. Go back to the major if you want to make an augmented triad, and then just raise the fifth. And those are your four basic triads, and that's one way to do it if you want to perceive of your major, minor, augmented, and diminished triads based on a major triad. So you can also do this by scale degree, which I talked a little bit about in the last lecture. So if we're in the key of C major, the first scale degree, if you build a triad on thirds using, let's say, C major as the base, or the first scale degree, you have C, E, and G. The minor triads are going to occur on scale degrees 2, 3, and 6. So that means in C major, the second scale degree is D, so I can build a triad on D. You hear that minor quality. I can also build a scale degree on E. So using the E scale degree as the basis for the triad, that also forms a minor triad. And the last one is going to be A minor. So if I build a scale in thirds on the sixth scale degree using the key of C major, I get an A minor triad. The diminished triad only occurs on the seventh scale degree in major. The augmented triad doesn't occur in major unless you actually borrow a tone from another key. So that's a third way to identify triads, but the most important ones are going to be triads based on the major triad and then based on interval quality. So I would learn them possibly first based on the major triad and then also learn based on calculating the intervals between the root, third, and fifth. So the next thing we have to talk about are triads and inversion. There are going to be 3 possible positions for triads, but only 2 inversions. We don't refer to an inverted chord as a position. So the only quality or the only position that we actually refer to as a position would be root position. First inversion and second inversion are the only ones that are actually inverted. And if you think about this, the root is a basis for the quality. So C major triad, right here we've got C, E, and G. This is in root position. If I take the bottom note, the C, and I move it to the top note, so E is now my bass note, I get first inversion. In classical style music, the root position and first inversion triads are the most common. The second inversion actually creates a bit of a problem, so it's not used very often. Root position is going to be the most stable. It just kind of doesn't want to go anywhere. It's happy to be in root position. It never wants to get off the couch. The first inversion, it has a little bit of dissonance, but it's still fairly consonant sounding, and it doesn't feel as stable as a root position, but it's more stable than second inversion. With second inversion, you use the fifth as a bass note, so in a C major triad, that will be a G. It's sort of an ambiguous triad. We can't really hear what chord is actually being played. It was used very rarely in the classical period because it was viewed to their ears as very unstable. So when you're identifying a triad in root position, I've got several voicings here. The only thing that matters is the note in the bass. So we see the C major triad, the C's in the bass. We see this next one, which is going to be a stretch for me. It's still a C major triad in root position because the C's in the bass. The next one is still a C major triad in root position because the C is in the bass. The one after that, still a C major triad. And then the last one, also a C major triad. Doesn't matter what's happening with the notes above the bass note. What we use to determine the position or the inversion is the lowest note in the piece. So if you have a massive orchestra piece, the lowest note in the piece is going to determine the position of the triad. So hopefully that's pretty clear. If a chord is not written in close position, so where everything is, within an octave and you can't fit any chord members in between any other chord member, then you have to first put it in close position like you see in the first example, C, E, G. You have to put it in close position to figure out what chord you're dealing with. And that's something that does confuse some students in the early stages. They don't realize that if they have a string quartet and there's 4 pitches, they have to stack that triad in thirds to figure out what inversion it's actually in, because you can't figure out the chord based on the bass note unless you stack everything in thirds first. So for first inversion, when triads are in first inversion, the third of the triad is the lowest note. This is the same chord. It's a C major chord. But now, my E is the bass note. Compare that to the root position C major triad. Hear how it just has more resonance? It sounds more stable compared to this. In some ways, the first inversion triad's a little bit lighter. And composers will often use a first inversion triad to create a lighter texture. It doesn't sound stable, so it allows a musical melody to push forward. If everything's in root position, it becomes very boring very quickly because everything is just very stable. None of these chords want to move. But if you move from a root position, you don't really hear it end until you come back to that root position triad. So I played a series of first inversion triads there, pretty much randomly. And then when I came back to that root position triad, it felt like the piece came to a close. So that root position is just really stable, and hopefully you're hearing that. So the same thing with root position. All these triads can be voiced any way you want. As long as a third of the chord is in the bass, it is a first inversion triad. So second inversion, the least stable of all the triads. The fifth is in the bass. It almost sounds deceptively like a root position triad, but it's not. It almost sounds like G is a bass note. But you don't have G as a bass note, so it tends to actually confuse the ear a little bit. We lose the tonality when we write second inversion triads. So something that's going to come up in some of these more advanced lessons is every time you see a second inversion triad, you need to look very closely to see if you're actually looking at a second inversion triad. That's number one. Number two, you need to look to see what device is actually being used, because second inversion triads are almost always part of some other technique. That's a little bit ambiguous right now, but it'll become more clear as you progress through these lessons. So of all the triads, the second inversion is going to be the least stable. So here's a summary of all the positions. This is a nice little screen that you can just take a screenshot of if you need to. Notice that this is the same triad for root, first, and second inversion. We're only dealing with triads right now. The root position, easily on that first chord, stacked in thirds, we can see that's clearly a C major triad. First inversion, it's still got the notes C, E, and G, but the third is in the bass, so that makes it inverted the first time, right? You invert it again, you take that E and you put the E on top, suddenly it becomes a second inversion triad. And the most important thing here is that you can see that all of these chords are essentially considered stable chords in root position if the root's in the bass. They're considered a little less stable if the third is in the bass, and they're considered really unstable if the fifth is in the bass. And this is actually a very powerful lesson, because when we start to get into concepts like the phrase model and tonal areas and how classical and romantic period composers put their works together, these concepts become extremely important. And some of this stuff is actually really quite fascinating.